What does a HEMA practitioner make of LARP weapons? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So, these are swords, two swords from Calimacil. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Canadian manufacturer, pretty much a high-level manufacturer of LARP weapons. Now, I know they've been featured, this manufacturer have been featured on other channels, but I don't really talk about LARP much on this channel, and I don't know why, because I actually know quite a lot of people involved in LARP, and a lot of HEMA practitioners also do LARP or also do reenactment. They tend to go in one direction or the other, but some do all of the above. I know people that do reenactment and LARP. Zach Evans is an example of that. Now, I am not, this might come as a shock to some of you, I am not a complete uninitiated to the world of LARP. I did actually, I was involved many moons ago when I was a teenager, about 16 I think. I was for a short time involved in a little bit of LARPing, and it was great fun. I've got nothing against LARP at all. As I say, lots of my friends do it, and maybe I'll do more of it at some point. And I have fought with LARP weapons a fair number of times in my life. And recently at Fight Camp, my friend Mark Gilbert runs melee games at Fight Camp. Now Mark does HEMA, he does modern, he trains with steel, he trains with nylon, but he also does LARP, and that's probably what he spends the majority of his time doing, or at least these are the types of weapons he uses. And he has been involved with historical LARP as well as obviously fantasy LARP. He does massive things like Empire and all of that. But he's a very good fighter. Okay, he is a good fencer. And now, full disclosure, he didn't learn everything he knows through LARP. I have been quoted by other people by saying that I know someone who learned everything they know through LARP. My understanding is that Mark actually has done a whole bunch of things, including SCA, modern fencing, obviously HEMA as well, and I think even Kendo. Anyway, but so he's done a whole bunch of stuff, but LARP is his main focus. And he has lent me these swords. So, two thank yous, one to Calimacil for making these, and a second thank you to Mark Gilbert for lending me these. Now, Lucy and I, and even the kids, have been playing with these in the garden, fighting with these, and they're pretty good. Now, I think there is a tendency in the HEMA community to look down on things that aren't HEMA, okay? And I'm not an exponent of that. I also do reenactment, I have done LARP, I've done many years of modern style fencing, and various other things I've done. So I hope that I'm never labelled as one of those HEMA people that looks down on other activities, because I think you can gain something from all sorts of stuff. And at the end of the day, it's about having fun. And sometimes people in HEMA forget that. So these weapons, they are pretty good. Now, what does a HEMA person, i.e. me, think about these? I should mention, I think this is a standard model, and I think this is a custom model, if I remember what Mark told me correctly. So functionally, they're quite similar, but they just look different. They've got different finishes and stuff on them. So this one's obviously made to look like sort of almost like meteoric iron, kind of old, and kind of maybe it's like it's been pulled out of a tomb. And this one looks more like something from a video game, basically. Right, so what's interesting to me is when I was involved in a bit of LARP when I was a teenager, which obviously was a long time ago now. I'm so old. The weapons were made in a different way. Now, these, instead of being foam with then latex over the top, which only the fancy ones are made of when I did LARP, these are made, that they're sort of, I think they're cast as one piece of foam over a fiberglass core, and I think you can choose between carbon fiber or fiberglass cores, and they have different strengths and weaknesses. I believe that the carbon fiber is stiffer, but the fiberglass is possibly tougher, and they break in different ways, when they break, if they break. So there's different pluses and minuses of those things, but I don't necessarily know all the ins and outs of those. But these are cast in one piece with a finish on them, and you can choose what type of finish you have. You could make the whole thing black if you wanted, or bright pink, whatever you like. Now, fundamentally, from a HEMA perspective, LARP weapons have a few issues. Okay, so the first issue that you'll notice when you start using them is they bounce off each other. Okay, so steel swords don't bounce off each other. I mean, they can do sometimes when you hit edge versus flat. Flatum strong crew out there, but when you hit edge versus edge, they do not bounce off each other like foam does. Okay, So there is a slight difference between the interactions of the blades. It is more difficult, although in no way impossible, and you can certainly do it, but it is more difficult to get what we call a bind with LARP swords, because when they hit each other, they tend to bounce away, even if just for a split second. So that means that a lot of the blade actions are more about motion rather than staying on a blade and doing things like winding, okay? Now, formerly with latex, there was a problem with stickiness of blades against each other, and this was one of the main objections to using latex over things in HEMA, was that the blades stuck in a way that steel blades don't stick, okay? Now, I have to say these don't do that at all. These actually slide against each other really very similarly to wood or steel, so no real problem there. So I would have no objections at all to using this type of material on this surface for HEMA training. Really, the main problem is the bounce. There is a slight problem in terms of the wibble, shall we call it. So if I just hold this weapon here and hit it, it does flex and vibrate. However, I have to say steel blades do that as well. So again, it's not a particular problem. So the slidiness is fine from a HEMA perspective. The sort of wibble of the blade, the wobble of the blade, the flexibility is not really a problem. The main problem is the bounce of the edges away from each other. Okay. That being said, that is of course what makes them safe and means that LARP fighters can hit each other without having to wear all the protective gear that we have to wear when using nylon or steel or whatever we're using. Right? Okay, so the next issue is weight. Now, you can't really get around this. These are really light, okay? Now, there's an interesting paradox or kind of physics situation in training weapons, and that is that you can simulate or at least compensate for the lightness, the over lightness of a weapon by changing the point of balance. And in fact, these are an example of that. So the point of balance on this is quite far up from the hand. It's about 10 inches, maybe 11 inches, which is much further away than a typical bastard sword or arming sword would be from the hand. Not all of them, some do balance out that far, but usually steel weapons are more balanced towards the hilt. Now, funnily enough, that helps compensate for the lightness of the weapon. So this is, I think these weigh about 500 grams, so about the weight of a fencing épée. So they're not like hugely light, but they are light compared to a steel sword. We'd expect a steel sword of this size and shape to weigh about 1200 grams, okay? So this is less than half of what a real sword would weigh, but again, that's part of what makes it safe. It's part of what makes them nice, fun training tools that you don't have to wear lots of protective equipment for. But as I say, the point of balance means that when you move the thing, because the point of balance is further away from the hand than a steel one would be, although they are lighter, they do move quicker, but they don't move as much quicker as you might think they do. And I would add to that also, because they are fat, they actually have some degree of air resistance, okay? So they don't move through the air quite as frictionlessly as a steel weapon does, okay? So you've got the fatness of the blade plus the point of balance being far from the hand actually means that these do move quicker than a steel sword, definitely, okay? But not as much quicker as you would think. But lightness is an issue, and that is particularly an issue when you get into the larger weapons. So I have noticed LARP, axes and glaives and things like this, and maces, move way too quickly for those weapon types. So swords, less of a problem, because real world swords are pretty quick anyway. So swords for LARP seem to work quite well, and spears work quite well. Except you can't thrust very well with them. We'll get to thrusting in a minute. But pole arms are a little bit OP in LARP, in my opinion, and I even found this years ago when I dabbled in the world of LARP. If you have a massive axe, you can move it way too quickly for the advantage it gives you in its size and reach. Okay, so I think there's an issue there. Right, thrusting. This is a major problem from a HEMA perspective. You can get thrust-safe LARP weapons, okay, and they have a different construction inside, but the fundamental problem is this is foam on the outside and inside is a hard core. And when you start happy hardcore, and when you start thrusting at people, the problem is the hard core wants to break through the soft foam. Not so much for a problem when you're cutting, because you've got a large surface area, but when you've now got a small surface area, that is a problem. The other problem is LARP weapons, at least in the world of LARP, are kind of married to the necessity to look like weapons. So the tips are kind of pointy, okay, they're a bit rounded, but they're kind of pointy, and you wouldn't want that in your eye, would you? So we do have a problem with thrusting from a HEMA perspective. There is a lesser problem that I've noticed, and that has to do with the hilts. Now the hilts have to have wibbly wobbly bendy crossguards, and that can be a problem with certain techniques where you rely on the crossguard to bind against the person's blade, or you're just defending, and the person's blade comes down here, bends past the crossguard and carries on going, and you're like, what the hell? Why didn't that stop on my crossguard? And it's because the crossguards are wibbly wobbly bendy, and I understand why they have to be, but if something could stiffen these up, it would make them better from a HEMA's perspective. The next criticism of the hilts is way more subtle, and that is that because the whole core flexes, while we're used to blades that flex, we are not used to hilts that flex. And one of the weird things I find when I'm fighting with my wife or my kids with these, which have been lent to me to try out, is that the handle, the grip, bends or kind of vibrates a lot, and that feels quite disconcerting to me because I'm not used to it, but I'm sure I'd get used to it. LARP weapons also tend to be a bit short, and I don't know why this is. So for a given blade type, if you get an arming sword or a long sword, or a rapier, then the blades for some reason are quite a lot shorter than the HEMA blades we're used to. And this actually led to a bit of, when I started using these, I would go for a cut and it would go straight past the person. I was like, what the hell's going on there? And it's because I'm used to a long sword having about that much more blade on the end. This, for me, would be one-handed sword length, but then the hilt's way too long for a one-handed sword. So some of the proportions, to me, are off in LARP weapons, at least the ones I have seen, not just Calimacil, but also other manufacturers as well. So, without much more blathering on, just to say, LARP swords are made for a specific activity. However, I would... If you're a HEMA fighter and you've never had a go with these, I'd actually recommend it because they are damned good fun. And one of the amazing virtues of them is that you could take them into your local park. Even in the UK, where we get arrested for anything under the sun these days, you could take these into a local park and nobody's going to arrest you for carrying them around or using them for training. You can train absolute beginners with these. You could get beginners sparring straight from, at the end of the first lesson kind of thing with these. And you don't have to wear lots of protective gear. You might want to put some protective glasses on, or even a face mask if you want. But fundamentally, these are designed to be safe with no protective gear on, which means you don't have to wear protective gear. And one of the things I hate the most in HEMA is protective gear that's really hot and really sweaty, especially in summer. So if you're living in a hot place or it's just a hot time of year, you could use these with no protection. So I think LARP weapons actually have a huge amount of potential. And I think with relatively few modifications, we could actually make LARP weapons which are useful in a HEMA environment. And even just the ones that you can buy from a good manufacturer like Calimacil are already pretty nice objects. They're well made, they're durable, they're safe to use. The only thing you have to be really careful with is thrusting, and I would say that if you buy one off the shelf for now, you just have to thrust softly and safely. You can still thrust with them, but probably avoid the face, or certainly avoid the eyes and the teeth. But you can still thrust with them, but you just do it lightly. You don't expect to jam the blade in and get a flex on the blade like you would with a steel weapon in full protective gear, because you will probably destroy the tips of these quite quickly. So I'd like to see safer and better solution for thrusting tips. I'd like to see the proportions corrected a bit. I'd like to see maybe the balance and the weight upped a little bit. I'd like to see stiffer crossguards. Some people in the comments will say, Matt, have you tried the Go Now padded sparring swords? I have. I'm not a huge fan of them, I'm afraid. I actually think there is a need in HEMA for some padded and safer, should we say, non-protective gear training weapons that are better designed than what's currently on offer. And honestly, at the moment, I actually prefer Calimacil LARP weapons as training aids than I do the Go Now sparring swords, which I honestly find quite horrible, to be honest, in a number of ways. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting. I know that a lot of LARPers watch this channel, so maybe this was interesting to you. What do I think of, or what does a HEMA person think of LARP weapons? There you go. Hopefully that's covered most of it. If you've got any questions, if I didn't cover anything, if you want to suggest other manufacturers to me or other products to check out, by all means do so down in the comments. But honestly, I really like these, and maybe I'll be looking at the potential for LARP weapons in some of the HEMA training we do, even if it's training with kids or just as, you know, beginner entry level things, or just something for going and have some fun down in the park with. I've certainly been having lots of fun with my kids and my wife with these in the garden with no protection on. Really, really good fun. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. Of course, I'll continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.